The first sound was the thunder of hooves on packed earth, a frantic drumbeat against the midday stillness of Redemption, Arizona. Then came the shattering of glass as the window of the territorial bank exploded inward. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the sudden chaos. James was standing across the street, his hand resting on a sack of flour he'd just purchased when the world erupted. He was not a man who sought trouble. Trouble, in his experience, had a way of finding him regardless. 4 riders, their faces masked by grimy bandanas, stormed the bank. James, an Apache man whose past was a landscape of ash and ghosts, felt an old instinct tense the muscles in his back. He was an outsider here, a necessary visitor in a town that tolerated his presence only for the coin in his pocket. To intervene was madness. To do nothing felt like a betrayal of a man he no longer was. He stayed put, his dark eyes missing nothing, his body a statue of coiled stillness. The robbery was brutal and fast. Gunshots echoed between the false-fronted buildings. Men shouted, their voices sharp with panic and greed. After what felt like an eternity, the masked men burst back out, leather satchels slung over their shoulders. One of them, clearly the leader, vaulted onto his horse. As he did, a silver chain snagged on his saddle horn and snapped. A small, intricately carved locket fell, landing in the thick dust of the street. Time seemed to slow for James. The locket, shaped like a desert primrose, spun in the air before settling its silver face, catching the unforgiving sun. His breath hitched in his chest. It couldn't be. He had carved that locket himself from a melted silver dollar, his clumsy fingers shaping the delicate petals for his wife Lena on the day their son was born. He remembered the way her eyes had lit up a warmth that could rival the sun. He had placed it around her neck himself a lifetime ago, before the soldiers came. Before the fire and the screams. Before his world ended at the banks of the river bend. The leader cursed and made a move to dismount, but the town was stirring. A shopkeeper emerged with a shotgun. The gang's leader made a decision, snarling an order to his men. He kicked his horse, leaving the locket behind. Without thinking, without weighing the consequences, James moved. He darted into the street, his focus narrowed to that single point of silver light in the dust. He scooped it up, the metal warm against his palm, a ghost of a memory so powerful it threatened to bring him to his knees. "Stop him! He's one of them!" a voice roared. James looked up, confused. The townspeople, their faces contorted with fear and rage, were looking at him. To them, he wasn't a bystander. He was an Apache, a convenient target for their terror. The real robbers were thundering out of town, but he was here, a dark-skinned man holding a piece of the loot. He was the lookout, another man shouted, leveling a pistol. James held up his free hand. "No," he said, his voice calm and clear. "You are mistaken." But they didn't hear his words. They only saw what they expected to see. The pistol cracked, and a searing pain exploded in his side. The impact threw him backward. He hit the ground hard, the locket still clutched tight in his fist. Through a haze of pain, he saw them advancing, a mob fueled by ignorance and fear. Survival, the one lesson the world had never stopped teaching him, took over. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the fire spreading through his ribs. He ran. He didn't know where, only away. He dodged down an alley, vaulted a fence, his wounded side screaming with every step. Behind him, shouts and more gunshots echoed. They were hunting him. He pushed himself harder, his vision blurring. He reached the edge of town and plunged into the merciless expanse of the desert, the sun hammering the cracked earth and the air shimmering like water over the glowing red sand. He ran until his lungs burned, and the blood from his side soaked his shirt, leaving a dark trail in the dust. Finally, miles from redemption, his strength gave out. The world tilted, the brilliant blue sky turning to black, and he collapsed, the silver locket, a cold, hard promise, against his failing heart. Belle Dawson knew the desert's cruel arithmetic. It decided who lived and who died, with an indifference that was both terrifying and absolute. She had learned its lessons from her father, a country doctor who had taught her which herbs cooled a fever and which ocotillo blossoms could be made into a poultice for burns. He had left her his weather-worn cabin perched high in the Mule Mountains and a legacy of healing that felt more like a duty than a choice. She was riding her gray mule Clementine that morning, and the air still holding the cool memory of night. A rifle was strapped to her saddle, a comfort in the vast, lonely silence. It was a solitude she had come to prefer. The town of Redemption, with its splintered boardwalks and whispering judgment, held little for her. Since her father's passing, she was an oddity, the spinster healer too educated for most men and too independent for the rest. As she guided Clementine through a rocky wash near the base of the mountains, a flicker of movement caught her eye. It wasn't the fluid grace of a coyote or the scuttling of a lizard. It was something broken. A man face down in the dirt, his body a dark shape against the rust-red soil. A dark stain spread from his side, buzzing with flies. Belle reined in, her heart thumping against her ribs. Frontier wisdom screamed at her to turn back. A wounded man in the desert could be a trap, or he could be trouble she had no business inviting into her quiet life. But her father's voice echoed in her mind, as clear as if he were riding beside her. You don't walk away from the dying, Belle. Not if your hands can help. She slid from the mule, her rifle held ready. Cautiously, she approached. He was Apache. The realization sent a jolt of fear through her. The stories told in town painted them all as savages. Yet as she knelt beside him, all she saw was a man bleeding out under the sun. His black hair was matted with dust and sweat, his lips cracked and swollen. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He was dying. With a sigh that surrendered to her conscience, as she set down her rifle, she gently rolled him over. His face was lean, carved with lines of hardship, but it was a strong face. His eyes were closed, his brow furrowed in pain, even in unconsciousness. In his tightly clenched fist, she saw the glint of silver. Prying his fingers open, she found a small, beautiful locket shaped like a flower. It seemed a strangely delicate thing for such a man to hold on to with his last breath. Lord help me, she muttered, tucking the locket into her pocket for safekeeping. He was heavier than he looked, all lean, hard muscle. Grunting with effort, she managed to haul him onto Clementine's back, draping him over the saddle like a sack of grain. The ride back up the winding trail to her cabin was excruciatingly slow. Belle walked beside the mule, one hand steadying the stranger's limp body, her mind racing. She wasn't just bringing home a patient. She was bringing home a war. The cabin, a small structure of weathered logs with a crooked stone chimney, felt like a sanctuary when they finally reached it. With her last reserves of strength, she wrestled him inside and onto the narrow cot that had once been her father's. For the next several hours, the world shrank to the confines of that room. Belle worked with the focused intensity her father had taught her. She fetched water, cleaning the grime from his face and trickling droplets between his parched lips. Then she tended the wound. The bullet had torn through his side, a ragged, angry hole that was already showing signs of infection. She set to work, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. She boiled her instruments, brewed a strong tea of willow bark for the fever, and prepared a poultice of mashed yarrow. As she cleaned and stitched the wound, she talked to him, her voice a low, steady murmur in the heavy silence. You're not dying on me, stranger. Not after I dragged you all the way up this mountain. You hear me? He stirred, once his eyes flickering open for a brief, disorienting moment. They were dark as obsidian, sharp, with a pain that went deeper than his physical wound. He looked at her, a flicker of confusion in their depths, before the fever pulled him back under. Through the long night, Belle kept vigil. She sponged his brow, forced more willow bark tea down his throat, and listened to the sound of his labored breathing. In his delirium, he spoke in his own tongue the words guttural and filled with a sorrow she couldn't understand. Once she heard him whisper a name, Lena, and then the name of a child, soft as a prayer. Exhaustion finally claimed her. She slumped into a chair at the table, her head pillowed on her arms, and drifted into an uneasy sleep. She dreamt of a silver flower blooming in the dust. James awoke to the scent of wood smoke and sage. The ceiling above him was made of rough-hewn logs, not the endless, indifferent sky. Pain, sharp and immediate, flared in his side, a brutal reminder of his flight from redemption. He tried to sit up, and a groan escaped his lips. Across the small room, the woman at the table startled awake. Her eyes the color of moss after a rain flew open, wide with alarm. For a second he saw fear in them. Then it softened into something else. Compassion. "Easy," she said, her voice low and steady. "You're safe here. The fever's broken." He lay back, his body weak, his mind clearer than it had been in days. He studied this strange white woman who had pulled him from the jaws of the desert. He remembered the faces in the town, twisted with hate. He remembered the gunshot. His people had 100 stories of betrayal at the hands of her kind. Yet she had saved him. Why, his voice was a dry rasp, the words scraping his throat. Belle paused, a bucket of water in her hand. She seemed to consider the question not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry. "Because you were dying," she answered simply. "And my father taught me that a life is a life." He held her gaze for a long moment, searching for the lie, the hidden motive. He found none. He gave the faintest of nods, a concession to a logic he couldn't dispute. For now. Trust was a currency James no longer possessed. During the slow days of his recovery, it was a ghost in the room, a silent third presence between him and Belle. He flinched when she came near to change his bandages. He accepted the food she offered, a thin broth, then a heartier stew, with a stoic suspicion that she found both frustrating and heartbreaking. He watched her every move, his dark eyes missing nothing, his silence a wall she could not seem to breach. One afternoon he managed to stand his legs unsteady. Leaning against the doorframe, he stared out at the vast, empty canyons. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to return to the wilderness that understood him better than any human ever could. "I leave," he said, his voice still rough. Belle, who had been grinding herbs at the table, stood up. "You can't. You're not strong enough. That wound will open up and you'll bleed to death before you make it a mile." His eyes hardened. "Your people left me to die." He said the words deliberate and heavy. "Why are you different?" The accusation hung in the air. Belle's jaw tightened. She wanted to be angry, to defend herself, but she saw the profound, unhealed wound behind his words. It wasn't just the gunshot in his side. It was a lifetime of them. "I can't speak for my people," she said quietly. "Only for myself. And I told you I don't walk away from the dying." He said nothing more, but that evening, when she placed a bowl of stew on the small crate beside his cot, he ate it without hesitation. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Slowly, the wall between them began to crumble stone by stone. He told her his name was James. Belle offered hers in return. He began to speak more, his English fluent, but measured as if he weighed each word before releasing it. She learned that he listened far more than he spoke, a trait she found herself admiring. He began to help with small tasks, first by whittling clothes pegs from scraps of wood. Then, as his strength returned, he insisted on mending the leaking roof of her cabin, his hands deft and sure. Belle would watch him, a strange stirring in her chest. The cabin, which had felt so empty since her father's death, began to feel like a home again. In return, she taught him more about her herbs, showing him the healing properties of the plants in her garden. He in turn showed her how to build a simple shade screen from woven branches to protect the delicate seedlings from the brutal afternoon sun. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the canyon walls in strokes of orange and purple, Belle spoke of her own past, of a husband who had left her telling her she was too quiet, too plain. "He made me feel like I was a broken thing," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. James was silent for a long time, carving a small piece of juniper wood with a pocket knife. "A man who must break something to feel strong," he said finally, not looking at her, "is the weakest of all." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. It was the first time anyone had defended her, and it came from the most unlikely of sources. A few days later, Sheriff Garrett rode up the trail. He was a tall, weary man with a sun-etched face and eyes that had seen too much. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the tidy cabin and lingering on James, who was splitting wood in the yard. "Miss Dawson," he said, tipping his hat, "heard you might have a guest." "I have a patient." Sheriff Belle corrected, her tone even. She stepped onto the porch, placing herself between the two men. Garrett's eyes narrowed on James. "There was a bank robbery in Redemption a few weeks back. One of the witnesses claimed an Apache was involved. A man fitting his description was seen fleeing town, wounded." James stopped his work, the axe held loosely in his hand. His face was a mask of impassivity, but Belle could see the tension in his shoulders. "This man was near death when I found him in the desert," Belle said, her voice firm. "He was shot, yes. But if you think he's a bank robber, you're mistaken." "And you know that for sure?" The sheriff pressed his gaze skeptical. "I'm a good judge of character, Sheriff Garrett. Better than a mob with pistols, anyway." The sheriff grunted, chewing on her words. He looked from Belle's defiant face to James's quiet stoicism. "I'll be asking more questions around town," he said, turning to his horse. "You be careful, Miss Dawson. Some folks won't take kindly to you sheltering him." As he rode away, a chill settled over Belle. The peace they had built was fragile, a thin pane of glass in a world full of stones. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. James finally broke the silence. "He thinks I am a thief." "He's wrong," Belle stated. James looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "But you do not know. You have only my word." Belle hesitated for only a second. "I have more than that. I have the way you handle a frightened mule, the patience you show a wilting plant, and the fact that you haven't tried to harm me once since you've been here. That's enough for me." She then reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the silver locket. "And I have this. I found it in your hand when I found you. It doesn't look like something a bank robber would be carrying." James's composure finally broke. He took the locket from her, his fingers tracing the familiar shape. A wave of grief so profound it was almost visible washed over his features. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name was Lena." He told her everything then. He spoke of the River Bend massacre, of the soldiers who had swept through his village like a plague, their rifles blazing. He spoke of his wife and his 6-year-old son lost in the slaughter. He spoke of his own fight for survival and the years of wandering a ghost, haunted by the faces of his family. And he spoke of the bank robbery, of seeing the locket, the last piece of his former life, and the subsequent betrayal by the people of Redemption. Belle listened, her heart aching for him. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. In that moment, the last stone of the wall between them crumbled into dust. They were no longer a white woman and an Apache man, a healer and her patient. They were two people scarred by the world who had found an unlikely refuge in each other. The man who dropped this, James said, his voice regaining its steel, the leader of the gang. He is connected to my past. I am certain of it. To see this locket after so many years, it is not a coincidence. Bell looked at the locket, then back at James. The sheriff's visit had been a warning, but James's story was a call to action. Then, we have to find out who he is, she said, her voice filled with a resolve that surprised them both. And we have to clear your name. The investigation began not with a bang, but with a whisper. James knew that returning to Redemption was a risk, but the locket was their only clue. They decided Belle would go alone, her presence less likely to provoke suspicion. Before she left, James described the leader of the gang in meticulous detail. Tall, broad-shouldered, with cold, pale blue eyes, visible above his bandana, and a way of sitting his horse that spoke of military training. Belle rode into town with a list of supplies, a plausible excuse for her visit. The general store was the heart of Redemption's gossip, and its owner Martha was a woman whose curiosity far outweighed her discretion. As Belle paid for flour and salt, she casually mentioned the robbery. Such a terrible thing, she said, shaking her head. Did they ever catch those men? Martha leaned over the counter, her voice dropping conspiratorially. Sheriff Garrett's got no leads. Says they vanished like smoke. Though she added, her eyes gleaming, some say that Apache you're keeping up at your place was involved. He was a victim. Martha, not a criminal, Belle replied, coolly refusing to be drawn into an argument. She changed the subject, asking about a traveling blacksmith who sometimes passed through the area, a man known for his skill with silver. I have a small piece I'd like repaired, she explained, producing the locket. Martha's eyes widened at the sight of it. My, that's fine work. Old Jebediah might know the maker's mark. He's got an eye for that sort of thing. Should be back in town by the end of the week. Belle thanked her and left feeling the weight of the town's suspicion on her back. When she returned to the cabin and told James, he nodded slowly. We wait for the blacksmith. During that week, the bond between them deepened into a quiet partnership. They worked side by side, repairing a fence, weeding the garden. In their shared labor, a comfortable silence grew, punctuated by conversation that was both practical and, at times, deeply personal. He taught her the Apache names for the constellations, pointing out the Great Bear and the trickster Coyote, telling her the stories his father had told him. She in turn read to him from one of her father's medical journals, explaining the Latin names of plants and their uses. When Jebediah the blacksmith arrived, Belle met him at the edge of town, away from prying eyes. He was a gnarled man with hands like leather mallets and soot permanently etched into the lines of his face. He took the locket, holding it up to the light with a jeweler's loop. Interesting, he grunted. This isn't local work. The style, the clasp, it's military. Made it myself, in fact, near a decade ago. Did a lot of custom work for the officers over at Fort Bowie back then. A young lieutenant had me make a dozen of these. Said they were gifts for the wives of his commanding officers. He squinted, trying to recall the name. Kane. That was it. Lieutenant Silas Kane. The name hit Belle like a physical blow. Silas Kane. She rode back to the cabin, her mind racing. James listened intently as she relayed the blacksmith's story. Kane. He repeated the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. I knew a Kane. He was a sergeant in the cavalry unit that attacked my village. They now had a name, but the motive remained shrouded in mystery. Why would a former army officer be robbing a small-town bank? And how did he come to possess Lena's locket? They needed more information. Belle remembered her father mentioning an old army clerk, a man named Peters, who had retired to a small homestead a day's ride east. He was known for keeping meticulous, albeit unofficial records of his service. The journey was a risk, but one they agreed they had to take. They rode together, moving through the harsh, beautiful landscape as a team. For the first time since the massacre, James did not feel entirely alone. They found Peters living in a dusty adobe hut, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers and ledgers. He was a frail man with watery eyes, but his mind was sharp. When Bell mentioned the name Silas Kane, his face soured. Silas Kane Peters spat. A brute dressed in a hero's uniform, rose through the ranks on ambition and cruelty. He led a volunteer unit, mostly misfits and malcontents. They called themselves Kane's Raiders. Left a trail of misery all through this territory. He shuffled through a worn ledger. Here we are, Riverbend. Officially listed as a military engagement against hostile forces. Unofficially. He looked up at them, his eyes sad. It was a massacre. Kane's report was full of lies, but we all knew. He received a commendation for it. Was there anyone else named Kane in his unit? James asked, his voice tight. Peters nodded, flipping a page. His younger brother, Private Daniel Kane, a hothead from what I heard. Records show he was killed in action at Riverbend. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The robbery wasn't for money. The locket wasn't a coincidence. It was bait. Silas Kane had orchestrated the whole thing to draw out a survivor of the Riverbend massacre. A survivor he believed had killed his brother. He is not hunting for land or gold, James said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as they rode back towards the mountains. He is hunting for me. The realization changed everything. This wasn't just about clearing James's name anymore. It was a personal war, a vendetta that had festered for a decade. And Belle, by saving James, had placed herself directly in its path. As the cabin came into view, nestled in the protective curve of the mountains, it no longer looked just like a home. It looked like the last bastion against a coming storm. The storm broke sooner than they expected. Silas Kane was not a patient man. When James failed to surface in redemption, Silas sent one of his men back to town to listen to the gossip. It didn't take long for the man to hear the whispers about the healer in the mountains and her mysterious Apache guest. The news that the survivor of Riverbend was alive and so close ignited Silas's cold fury into a blazing inferno. But he was a strategist, a man who understood the power of perception. A direct assault on the cabin was too simple, too messy. He wanted more than just to kill James. He wanted to destroy him, to turn the world against him, just as he believed James had destroyed his own. He rode into redemption not as a bandit, but as a righteous crusader. Dressed in a clean coat, his military bearing unmistakable, he was charismatic and commanding. He strode into the saloon, bought a round for the house, and began to tell his story. It was a masterpiece of deception, a tapestry woven from half-truths and outright lies. He spoke of his heroic younger brother Daniel, a brave soldier cut down in his prime. He painted a picture of the Riverbend massacre not as a slaughter, but as a desperate battle against a savage war party. And at the head of that war party, he claimed was a brutal warrior, a monster who had murdered his brother in cold blood. For 10 years I have hunted this killer, Silas announced, his voice ringing with false piety. And now I have found him. He hides in these very mountains under the protection of a woman named Belle Dawson. Fear and prejudice were dry tinder, and Silas's words were the spark. The townspeople, already suspicious of James, readily accepted this new narrative. It was easier to believe in a savage Apache than a decorated soldier-turned-bandit. Silas became their hero, the man who would deliver them from the monster in their midst. He solidified his control, posting a generous bounty on James's head, dead or alive, and deputizing his own gang members, turning criminals into lawmen overnight. Redemption was no longer just a town, it was his fortress. Up at the cabin, Belle and James felt the shift immediately. The trickle of neighbors seeking Belle's help dried up completely. A trip to the spring one morning revealed a crude sign hammered to a tree Indian lover. The world had shrunk their mountain refuge, transformed into a prison. The pressure escalated. One night, a volley of shots tore through the darkness, splintering the cabin's doorframe. They weren't trying to hit them. They were trying to terrorize them, to wear them down. "He is trying to draw me out." James set his face grim as he inspected the bullet holes. "He wants me to come down there into his trap." Belle's hands trembled as she swept up the wood splinters. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. "We can't just wait here for him to decide when to finish this." "He has the town," James countered. "We have one rifle and a bow." "We also have the truth." Belle said, her chin set stubbornly. But she knew the truth was a poor shield against bullets. She thought of the retired clerk Peters and his stacks of ledgers. There had to be something more, some piece of tangible proof that could shatter Silas's lies. "I have to go back," she said suddenly. "Back to Peters." Kane's official report, Peters said it was full of lies. There might be something in it, a discrepancy, a detail that proves he's deceiving everyone. Or maybe Peters has something else, a letter, another record. "It is too dangerous," James argued. "His men are everywhere." "It's more dangerous to do nothing," she insisted. "You know these mountains better than anyone. You can keep me safe on the journey. It's our only chance, James." He looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her moss-green eyes. She was no longer just the compassionate healer who had saved his life. She was a fighter as fierce in her own way as any warrior he had ever known. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. They would fight this together. Their journey was a harrowing trek through shadows and moonlight. They traveled at night, James guiding them along forgotten trails, his senses preternaturally sharp. He moved with a silent grace that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. They reached Peters's homestead just before dawn, finding the old clerk terrified. News of Silas's takeover of Redemption had reached him. "I knew he was a devil," Peters whispered, his hands shaking as he led them inside. "I kept something. I always thought it might be important one day." He dug into an old wooden chest and pulled out a small leather-bound diary. It belonged to a soldier who served under Kane. He died of fever a year after Riverbend. His effects were sent to me. I never forwarded this. Belle opened the diary. The soldier's entries were brief, but on the date of the massacre, the writing was a frantic scrawl. D. Kane was a fool, drunk on whiskey and hate. He fired first on the women by the river, disobeyed a direct order. The sergeant tried to stop him, but it was too late. All hell broke loose. The Apache warrior who killed him. He was just defending his family. We started it. God forgive us, we started it all. Belle's breath caught in her throat. She looked at James, her eyes wide. It was the proof they needed. Silas's entire crusade, his decade of vengeful hatred, was built on a lie. His brother wasn't a hero. He was the monster who had lit the fuse. But as they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching horses sent a spike of dread through them. Silas's men. They had been followed. "Go," Peters urged, shoving the diary into Belle's hands, through the back. "There's a dry creek bed that leads to the canyons. I'll hold them off." Before they could argue, the old man grabbed a rusty shotgun and stood by his door. James grabbed Belle's arm, his face a mask of grim urgency, and pulled her out the back. As they scrambled into the arroyo, the first gunshot echoed behind them. They didn't look back. They just ran. The sky was turning a sickly shade of yellow-gray as they raced back toward the mountains. The air grew heavy, thick with dust, and the wind began to howl, a low moan that rose to a piercing shriek. A sandstorm. The desert was unleashing its own fury, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation that was now inevitable. When they reached the high ground overlooking Redemption, they saw that Silas had made his final move. He had Belle's mule Clementine tied to the hitching post outside the saloon. He had taken her home. He was goading James, using the last thing in the world James cared about to force a showdown. "He has my cabin," Belle breathed, her heart sinking. "He does not want the cabin." James said, his voice deadly calm, his eyes fixed on the town below. "He wants me." He looked at Belle, the howling wind, whipping strands of hair across her face. He took the diary from her and tucked it securely inside his shirt. "Stay here. When the storm is at its worst, get to the sheriff's office. Find Garrett. Show him this. The truth is your weapon. Let me use mine." Before she could protest, he was gone, melting into the swirling dust like a phantom. The sandstorm hit Redemption with the force of a physical blow. Dust, thick as smoke, blotted out the sun, turning day into a suffocating twilight. The wind screamed through the streets, ripping shingles from roofs and sending a tumbleweed bowling past the saloon doors. Inside, Silas Kane stood at the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smug smile on his face. He had Belle tied to a chair in the center of the room, his men posted at the doors and windows. The townspeople huddled in their homes, prisoners of both the storm and Silas's tyranny. "He'll come for you," Silas said to Belle, his voice smooth and confident over the storm's roar. "His honor will demand it. And when he does this, whole town will see him for the savage he is as he dies in the street." Belle met his gaze, her own, unflinching. "You're the savage, Silas, and you're a fool. Your whole life is built on a lie." Silas's smile tightened. He raised a hand to strike her, but at that moment the saloon's back door burst inward with a splintering crash. A gust of sand and wind blinded everyone for a second. When they could see again, one of Silas's men was on the floor, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. James was nowhere to be seen. Panic erupted. Silas's men fired wildly into the swirling dust outside. Another arrow flew from the darkness, silencing a second guard. James was using the storm as his ally, a hunter in his element. He was a ghost, a whisper, a sudden deadly force. Silas snarled, shoving a table over for cover and dragging Belle's chair behind it. "He's in here," he roared. The fight became a chaotic, terrifying dance in the gloom. The lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. James moved through them, a blur of motion. He disabled Silas's men not with lethal force, but with brutal efficiency, using his knife, his hands, and the arrows from his bow to break bones and sever tendons. He was a warrior, unleashed. Finally, only Silas was left. He stood over Belle, a pistol pressed to her head. "Show yourself," he screamed into the maelstrom. "Face me." James stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the room, his bow held loosely at his side. His face was calm, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to cut through the dusty air. "You murdered my brother Silas," hissed his voice, cracking with a decade of grief and rage. He was just a boy. "Your brother died because of his own hate," James said, his voice low and even. At that moment, the saloon doors swung open. Sheriff Garrett stood there, a shotgun in his hands, Belle beside him. She had slipped away in the chaos, circling around to the sheriff's office as James had instructed. She held the soldier's diary in her hand. "It's over, Kane," the sheriff said, his voice grim. He's lying. Silas shrieked, his eyes wild. The Apache is a murderer. Your brother fired on unarmed women and children. Silas Bell's voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the storm. She began to read from the diary, her voice unwavering, as she recounted Private Daniel Kane's drunken, murderous actions. Every word was a hammer blow to the foundation of Silas's life. His face, already pale, turned ashen. The pistol in his hand trembled. The righteousness that had fueled him for 10 years crumbled, leaving behind a hollow, pathetic man. He looked at James not with hatred, but with a horrifying, dawning comprehension. His life had been a lie. His vengeance was a sham. He let out a strangled sob, and the pistol clattered to the floor. James walked slowly across the room until he stood before the broken man. Every instinct, every ghost from his past, screamed for him to take his revenge, to end the life of the man whose family had destroyed his own. He raised his knife, the polished steel glinting in the dim light. He could feel the pulse of his own rage, the deep, satisfying pull of retribution. Then he looked past Silas and saw Belle. She was watching him, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound, trusting faith. In her gaze, he saw not the bloody past he was trying to avenge, but the peaceful future he could choose. The face of Lena, his lost wife, rose in his mind, and for the first time, her memory did not bring pain, but a gentle release. Vengeance would not bring her back. It would only chain him to her grave. With a deep, shuddering breath, James lowered the knife. He had won not by killing his enemy, but by refusing to become him. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. In the silence that followed, Sheriff Garrett stepped forward and placed handcuffs on Silas Kane's wrists. The fight was over. As the last of the wind died down, the dust began to settle both in the streets of Redemption and in the souls of its people. Sheriff Garrett led a hollow-eyed Silas Kane to the town jail the soldier's diary held as evidence. The truth, once revealed, was undeniable. The townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of shame and awe, as they looked at James, no longer seeing a savage, but a man who had been grievously wronged. They had been so eager to believe a convenient lie, and now they had to live with the ugly truth of their own prejudice. James and Belle left the saloon without a word, walking through the quiet streets and back up the trail to her cabin. The air was washed clean, smelling of rain and damp earth. When they arrived, they surveyed the damage, the splintered door, the bullet holes in the walls, relics of a battle that felt a lifetime ago. They worked together, their movements synchronized and comforting. James patched the door, while Belle cleaned the wounds they had both sustained, a shallow cut on her arm, a deep bruise on his shoulder. They didn't speak of the fight, or of Silas, or of the future. The silence was not empty, but filled with a shared understanding, a deep and abiding relief. They had faced the storm and survived. In the days that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the valley. A few of the townsfolk made the ride up to the cabin, offering awkward apologies, a sack of potatoes, a freshly baked pie. They were small gestures, but they signaled a profound shift. Belle accepted them with quiet grace, and James with a silent nod. Forgiveness was a long road, but this was a start. They rebuilt the cabin, making it stronger than before. As they worked, they talked. James spoke more of Lena and his son, not with the raw agony of before, but with a gentle sadness, sharing memories as one might share old photographs. Belle spoke of her dreams of expanding her garden, of perhaps even training an apprentice one day. They were mapping out a future together. The seasons turned. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold, and winter brought a light dusting of snow to the mountain peaks. The cabin was a haven of warmth and light against the cold. The quiet rhythm of their life together became a healing balm. One clear spring evening, months later, when the desert was bursting with the improbable color of wildflowers, James led Belle to a high ridge overlooking the valley. The setting sun bathed the world in a soft golden light. For a long time they stood in silence, simply breathing in the beauty and the peace. Finally, James turned to her. From his pocket he took the silver locket. It was polished, now gleaming in the twilight. "This belonged to Lena," he said, his voice soft. "It represents my past, all the love and all the loss." He held it out to her, his hand steady. "The grief will always be a part of me, but I will no longer be its prisoner. I am asking you to help me carry it." Tears welled in Belle's eyes as she understood. He was not asking her to replace his past, but to join him in building a future that could hold it. She took the locket, her fingers closing around the cool metal. "I will," she whispered. He took her hand, his scarred fingers lacing through hers. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a love that was as quiet and as powerful as the mountains around them. He was not a man of many words, but in that look, Belle saw promise of 1,000 sunrises, of shared burdens and quiet joys, of a home built not of logs and stone, but of two mended hearts finally at peace.